Welcome to this deep dive, and today we're going to be going into a really fascinating story, one that connects religion and politics and business. Even some criminal accusations are in here. You ready?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a lot to untangle, that's for sure.
So you gave me like a ton of articles and social media posts about this group called the Science of Identity Foundation, or SIF, and the main person seems to be this guy named Chris Butler.
Yeah, well, what's so interesting is that SIF, it isn't like your typical religious group. There are actually allegations of it being a cult, and they seem to have connections all over the place, like in politics, even in business.
Yeah, I saw a lot about Tulsi Gabbard,
Is that right?
the former congresswoman and presidential candidate. What's her connection to all this?
Yeah, Gabbard's really key to all of this. The sources say that she was raised in SIF and that she's still a follower of Butler's, and they even say that SIF has had a huge impact on her political career. Some even call her Butler's puppet.
Whoa. Okay, so let's unpack this.
Okay.
Let's start with F. What can you tell us about Chris Butler and how this group works?
Well, Butler's story is a wild one. He joined ISKCon, the Hare Krishna movement, in the late 70s, but he didn't just quietly join.
Right.
He came in with this huge donation property in Hawaii, even a bunch of followers, maybe the largest group ever to join ISKCon at once.
So he was already a leader.
Exactly. And once he was in, he started saying he was the true representative of ISKCon's founder, basically trying to make himself the successor.
Oh, so there must have been some drama.
Oh, yeah, big time. There's a lot of different stories about what happened exactly, but it was definitely a power struggle. And Butler ended up breaking away from ISKCon to form his own group, which became the Science of Identity Foundation.
Okay, and now some sources say SIE uses some pretty intense methods to control their members. What are some examples of that?
One of the main things is that they isolate their members. They try to discourage them from talking to anyone outside the group. Butler teaches that people who aren't devotees can be dangerous to your spiritual well-being. And this isolation even extends to where people live, sometimes shared houses or communes, and young single women, they're kept separate from men until marriage. And guess what? The marriages are usually arranged by Butler himself.
He arranges marriages, so what happens if things go wrong? Can people get divorced?
Well, the sources say there's a lot of pressure to stay in marriages that are SIF approved. So if you fall out of favor, you might be pressured to divorce your spouse. It's all about control.
Wow, that's a lot of control over people's lives. What other ways does SIF exert control over people?
Well, there are some stories of public humiliation being used as punishment. Like one story describes members having to wear bags on their heads.
Bags on their heads? Seriously, what for?
It's not clear what they did to deserve that, but former members talk about threats of spiritual death if they disobey Butler, and then there's always the threat of being kicked out of SIF. And that can mean losing your family, too, if they're members.
So leaving SIF would be incredibly tough, both emotionally and practically.
Absolutely. And we have to remember, SIF, they paint a very different picture publicly. But these stories from people who've left suggest a much darker reality.
Yeah, it's a huge contrast. But before we get into SIF's public image and Gabbard, how do they recruit new members if they're so isolated?
Yeah, that's where things get really interesting. The sources point to this like multi-pronged approach. And one of the main ways they recruit is through meditation centers and yoga studios.
Wait, so you could walk into a yoga studio and accidentally be getting involved with SIF?
Maybe these centers, they don't always have names that scream SIF, like the Australian School of Meditation or the Czaitanii Mission. So people might be drawn in by the yoga or the meditation and not realize the connection.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and then there are these outreach programs, too, targeting public spaces, libraries, even college campuses. Some sources even say they use that WWOS program, the one where you work on organic farms.
It's W-woofing.
Yeah.
Seriously. I always thought W-woofing was this independent, free-spirited thing. To think it could be used for... This is disturbing.
It really is. It shows how these groups can operate in ways we don't expect.
Yeah.
And then some people talk about this subliminal indoctrination, where you're exposed to Butler's chanting through Wailana yoga videos, or even just by eating Vegeta's veg chips.
Hold on, veg chips? You mean like the healthy chips you get at the store?
Yeah, those are ones that apparently the company behind Vegeta's is also the parent company of the down-to-earth vegetarian grocery stores. And get this, SIF is supposedly financially tied to them too. Remember those big donations Butler brought to ISKCon? That financial power seems to have stayed with him?
So people could be supporting SIF without even realizing it?
Yeah, that's the scary part. It really shows how deeply this network is woven into things we do every day, and it makes you wonder just how far it goes.
This is getting crazy. So we've got this group SIF led by Chris Butler, who has a history of controversial claims and alleged cult-like practices. They might be recruiting people and making money through things like yoga meditation and even snack foods. But where does Tulsi Gabbard fit into all of this? How does SIF's influence reach into politics?
Yeah, so that's where things get really intriguing. Gabbard, remember, she was raised within SIF, and those who accuse SIF of being a cult, they also say that she's remained a devoted follower of Butler her entire political career.
And she's had a pretty high-profile career, right? 2 terms in Congress, even a presidential run, if that's true. That's a lot of influence.
It is, and there were some specific examples in the sources. For instance, in 2015, Gabbard hired Kanoa Pennerosa as her chief of staff. His father, Bill Pennerosa, was a leader in SIF and was really involved in the Independence for Godly Government Party, which Butler started in the 70s. So you can see a direct link through family ties between Gabbard's inner circle and SIF's political history in Hawaii.
So it's not just about her personal beliefs, but potential operational ties to SIF through her staff. That's a whole other level.
Exactly, and it goes even further. The sources highlight Gabbard's defense of the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and her ties to Hindu nationalism, which seemed to align with some of SIF's ideology. There's even an incident where Gabbard opposed a resolution condemning religious violence in India.
Yeah.
A lot of people saw that as criticism of Modi and his Bharatiya Janata Party, or the BJP.
For those of us who don't know much about Indian politics, can you explain the BJP and why this is significant?
Sure. The BJP, they've been accused of pushing Hindu supremacy and marginalizing religious minorities in India. So Gabbard's support of Modi and her opposition to that resolution, they raise some serious questions, especially if she really is under Butler's influence, like some people say.
It makes you wonder if those decisions were really hers or if something else was going on. This is getting intense.
And we're just getting started. We haven't even talked about the allegations of criminal activity connected to SIF.
Wait, there's more. This deep dive is blowing my mind already.
Oh yeah, we're going even deeper. Are you ready to explore the criminal underbelly of this whole network?
Definitely tell me everything.
Okay, so the sources talk about these 2 high-ranking SIF members, Patrick Bowler and Alan Tibby. They've both been linked to some serious criminal activities.
Okay, this is where it gets interesting. Who are these guys and what did they do?
Well, Patrick Bowler, he went by Paramahamsa Das in SIF. He was a big-time drug trafficker back in the 80s and early 90s. He was eventually caught in Switzerland and served time in prison in the U.S. But here's the crazy part. After his arrest, Bowler became a DEA informant, and he reportedly put his life on the line for undercover assignments all over the world.
So a drug trafficker turned DEA informant, all while being a high-ranking member of this supposedly spiritual organization. This is like something out of a movie.
I know, right? Truth is stranger than fiction sometimes. And then Alan Tibby, or a Kuryadas, as he was known in SIF, he has a different criminal history.
Yeah.
He's been accused of being part of a multi-million-dollar pyramid scheme through a company called QNET.
Oh, I've heard of them. They've been called out as a scam, preying on people with promises of getting rich quick.
Exactly. And the connection back to SIF is that QNET allegedly used down-to-earth stores, remember those grocery stores owned by Healthy's Inc.? Well, they allegedly used them to launder money. So you've got this tangled web of illegal financial dealings, all connected back to SIF and its businesses.
So we've gone from yoga studios and snack chips to international drug trafficking and pyramid schemes, all within this seemingly peaceful religious group. This is mind-blowing.
It really is. But it's important to remember this is just one side of the story. We also need to consider the human impact of all of this, and the sources we have, they include some heartbreaking accounts from former SIF members who describe years of emotional, psychological, and even physical abuse.
Let's talk about that. What kinds of things did these ex-members go through?
Well, they talk about really harsh punishments, not just that bag on the head incident, but physical beatings too, especially in the SIF boarding schools where they sent some children. Those schools were located in places like the Philippines, and they were supposedly full of abuse. Former students talk about being forced to wake up at 4 a.m., take cold showers, and spend hours chanting and worshiping, all while being physically disciplined by older members.
It's hard to believe that kids would go through that kind of treatment, especially in the name of spirituality. What about those who managed to leave SIF? What are the long-term effects?
A lot of them describe struggling with the psychological effects, dealing with trauma, fear, having a hard time fitting back into society.
Right.
Some even had to cut ties with family members who stayed in SIF, which just made things even harder.
That's just awful, and it's such a contrast to the image that SIF projects and Gabbard's denials of any wrongdoing. It makes you wonder how much of this is still hidden.
That's the question. And it really shows how important it is to think critically and be careful about the information we take, especially in a world where information spreads so quickly, good and bad.
Yeah, this deep dive has definitely shown how important it is to look beyond the surface and question the narratives we're given, especially by groups that seem harmless on the outside.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So what stands out to you so far? What are you thinking?
Yeah, it is. It's pretty disturbing to think about, especially with how SIF presents itself publicly. But I'm also curious to go deeper into Tulsi Gabbard's career. Like, how did it all play out against this backdrop of, potential SIF influence? Her early positions especially seem pretty closely aligned with SIF's ideology, right?
Yeah, that's right. Gabbard's entry into politics was really tied to her family, who were heavily involved with SIF. Her father, Mike Gabbard, was a prominent figure in that Independence for Godly Government Party, the one founded by Chris Butler. Are you familiar with that party?
Not really. What were they about?
Well, the Independence for Godly Government Party, or the IGG, was founded by Butler in Hawaii back in the 70s. It was basically a vehicle for his conservative and religiously driven political views. They were all about traditional family values. They opposed abortion and same-sex marriage, and they were big on a strong military.
Oh, okay.
And Gabbard's mother, Carol, she was also active in politics, and she eventually won a seat on the Hawaiian Board of Education.
So the whole family was really immersed in this blend of politics and religion, all orchestrated by Butler. It seems like that their political ambitions were very connected to their commitment to SIF.
Yeah, that's the picture that emerges from the sources. And for Tulsi Gabbard, this really showed in her early career, especially on the issue of same-sex marriage.
Yeah, this is interesting because her views on that have changed so much over time, but in the beginning she was totally against it, right?
Well, absolutely. Her early opposition was quite extreme. She actually worked with her father in his organization, stopped promoting homosexuality. She even had a radio show called Let's Talk Straight Hawaii, where she said things that a lot of people considered homophobic. And remember, this was all while she was serving in the Hawaii House of Representatives.
Wait, so she was already a politician while actively campaigning against LGBTQ plus rights? That doesn't really fit with the image she has now.
It does seem contradictory, but you have to remember the context back then. Her views were in line with her family's, and more importantly, with Chris Butler's teachings. Butler interprets Hindu scripture as condemning homosexuality as a sin.
So her early political positions, especially on this very sensitive issue, could be seen as a direct reflection of SIF's influence.
A lot of the sources suggest exactly that. They argue that she was essentially carrying out Butler's agenda, using her political platform to push his conservative social views. It's a pretty bold claim, but it makes you think, right, how much of her political identity was shaped by SIF?
Yeah, it's a little unsettling to think about, but then she does a complete 180 on same-sex marriage. She becomes a vocal advocate for marriage equality. What caused that shift? Was it genuine or more strategic?
That's the big question. Gabbard says it was her experiences in the military that changed her mind. She served 2 tours in the Middle East, and she says seeing gay and lesbian soldiers fighting and sacrificing alongside street soldiers made her realize that love is love and that everyone deserves equal rights.
Okay, that makes sense, but some sources suggest there might be other reasons for that shift, maybe something more political or calculated.
Yeah, some people think it was purely strategic. The timing of her shift coincided with a broader shift in public opinion, both in Hawaii and nationally. And as she started aiming for higher office, first Congress, then the presidency, it makes sense that she'd adapt her views to appeal to more voters.
So it could be a genuine change of heart, a savvy political move, or maybe a bit of both. It's hard to know for sure.
Yeah, exactly. And the sources don't give us a clear answer. They just present the facts and let you, the listener, decide what you think.
Yeah, and that's what I like about this deep dive. It's not about telling me what to think, but giving me the information to think for myself.
Right. The goal is to give you the knowledge and context to form your own informed opinion.
Okay, so we've seen how Gabbard's early stances, especially on same-sex marriage, were very much in line with SIF's ideology and Butler's teachings. But then she changes on this key issue as her career progresses. It makes you wonder how much of her political journey was really hers and how much was shaped by SIF.
Right. And that brings us to the question of whether SIF directly influenced her political agenda, using her to push their own interests. This is where the line between religious affiliation and political influence gets really blurry.
And it's not just vague suspicions, right? We have concrete examples like hiring Kainoa Pennerosa as her chief of staff. His father was a SIF leader, which suggests a more deliberate connection.
Exactly, and it goes beyond personnel choices. Remember our discussion about Gabbard's strong defense of Narendra Modi and her ties to Hindu nationalism? Well, that aligns with some of SIF's own ideology.
Yeah, Her defense of Modi has been controversial, especially with his party's history of marginalizing religious minorities and promoting Hindu supremacy in India. If she was truly acting under Butler's influence, that's a big problem.
It is, and it leads to a bigger question. How much power does a religious leader, especially one accused of leading a cult, have over a politician's choices? This goes beyond just Gabbard and touches on the whole idea of separating church and state.
It's a huge question, especially here in the U.S., where religious freedom is so important, but it also makes you worry about manipulation and hidden agendas when religion and politics mix.
Absolutely. And it gets even more complicated when you factor in the financial ties we talked about between SIF and Healthy's Inc. The parent company of Down to Earth, those financial connections might go even further, potentially linking SIF to some shady international business ventures.
Wait, there's even more to the financial side of this. I thought we covered that already. This just keeps getting deeper and deeper.
Oh yeah, there's more to uncover. The sources point to these two high-ranking SEF members, Patrick Bowler and Alan Tibby. They've both been implicated in criminal activities that could shed light on SIF's global reach and financial dealings.
Okay, those names sound familiar. Patrick Bowler, the drug trafficker turned DEA informant, and Alan Tibby, the one who was allegedly part of that QNET pyramid scheme.
Yeah, those are the ones. So how do they connect back to SIF and Gabbard? It's complicated, but here's what the sources say. Patrick Bowler, even with his criminal past, was supposedly a respected figure within SIF-LEF. He even sponsored that SIF boarding school in the Philippines, the one that Gabbard herself might have attended for a time.
Hold on, so Gabbard was potentially connected to a convicted drug trafficker within SIF. That's a pretty direct link, even if it's uncomfortable.
It is, and remember Alan Tibby and his alleged involvement with QNET. Well, it gets even more interesting. The sources allege that QNET used Down to Earth stores, those vegetarian grocery stores owned by Healthy's Inc., to launder money.
Your kid. So Healthy's Inc., the company S is supposedly linked to, might also be tied to this global pyramid scheme through their stores.
That's what they're saying, and it raises questions about SIF's finances and whether those dealings impacted Gabbard's political career. Gabbard has always denied any wrongdoing and distanced herself from both Bowler and Tibby, but the connections are there, and they suggest a network that goes way beyond just a religious group.
This deep dive is like a conspiracy thriller. We've got a potential cult, a charismatic politician, international drug trafficking, a multi-million-dollar pyramid scheme, and now money laundering.
It's a lot to take in, but it's important to remember that these are allegations and we need to be critical, but the amount of information and how interconnected everyone and everything is definitely warrants further investigation.
Absolutely. And as we look at Gabbard's political career, especially her rise to national prominence and that surprise appointment as Director of National Intelligence, we need to keep all of this in mind. How much did SIF influence her path, and what are the implications of her holding such a sensitive position given these allegations? What are your thoughts on all this?
Yeah, it really is a lot to think about, all this potential influence and criminal connections. It makes you wonder about her motivations behind some of her decisions.
Right, and it becomes even more important when we look at her rise to national prominence. Remember, she won a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives in 2012 for Hawaii's 2nd Congressional District. That was a big jump from the state legislature.
Yeah, and it was a big change, too, because she ran as a Democrat, even though her family had ties to the Republican Party, and Butler's views are pretty conservative. Some people thought it was strategic, maybe even Butler's idea to get influence within the Democratic Party.
Yeah, that's an interesting theory. Butler pulling strings from inside the Democratic Party. A little sneaky, right? So did she actually do anything in Congress that would support that idea?
Well, she did often go against the Democratic Party line, especially on foreign policy and national security.
Yeah.
She was really against U.S. intervention in the Middle East.
Yeah.
Calling for an end to those regime change wars.
Right, and those views caused some tension, but they also got her support from some voters, right? Like those on the left who weren't happy with the Democrats' more hawkish foreign policy positions.
Definitely. And it's interesting that those positions also line up with Butler's own anti-war views. He's been preaching against violence and U.S. military actions for decades.
So her stance on these issues, which got her support from both sides, could be seen as serving her own ambitions and Butler's agenda at the same time.
Some sources definitely argue that they say she was trying to walk this fine line, appealing to a wide range of voters while staying true to Butler's teachings.
That's a tough balancing act for sure. It makes you wonder how much of her platform was really hers, how much was SIF. What do you think?
It's a tough question. It's important to remember the environment she grew up in and how that could have shaped her thinking.
Right, and we can't forget those allegations of abuse and manipulation within SIF. That environment must have had an impact on her.
Absolutely. You can't underestimate the psychological impact of growing up in a place like that.
And those allegations of SIF's influence, they kept coming up as she got more attention, even when she ran for president in 2020.
Yeah, her campaign was definitely controversial. A lot of people questioned her ties to SIF and to right-wing figures like Steve Bannon. Some people thought he was using her to cause problems for the Democrats.
And her campaign didn't really go anywhere. She dropped out before the primaries, but her political career didn't end there, did it?
No, it took a surprising turn in 2024 when President Trump appointed her as the Director of National Intelligence.
Wow, that was unexpected. The Democrat in such a high position appointed by Trump of all people.
Yeah, it definitely caught people off guard. Some thought Trump was trying to shake things up in the intelligence community, and it's hard to ignore her alleged ties to SIF in that role.
That's a powerful position. The Director of National Intelligence oversees all the U.S. intelligence agencies, the CIA, the NSA, the FBI. It requires complete loyalty to the U.S. and its interests.
Exactly, and if those allegations about SIF are true, it makes you wonder where her loyalties lie with the U.S. or with Butler and his teachings. What do you think?
It's a scary thought, really. It shows how dangerous religious extremism can be even when it's disguised as spirituality, and how it can reach the highest levels of government.
This whole deep dive has taken us through some pretty complicated stuff. Religion, politics, money, power. We might not have all the answers, but we've definitely found a lot of important questions that need more attention. What are some key things that stood out to you?
For me, it really shows how important awareness and critical thinking are. We need to understand how these groups work, how money affects politics, and how religious beliefs can influence political decisions sometimes in ways that might not be good for the country.
Absolutely, and I think it also shows that we have a responsibility as citizens to stay informed, to question things, and to challenge those in power, no matter what they believe or who they're connected to.
This has been fascinating and honestly a little unsettling. Thank you for helping me understand all of this. It's given me a lot to think about.
You're welcome, and I always encourage listeners to keep learning to look at things from different angles and to make up their own minds based on the evidence.
Yeah, in a world with so much information, it's more important than ever to be careful about what we believe, to be skeptical, and to stay involved.
That's the best way to deal with how complicated the world is. And with that, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive.
It's been a wild ride. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep diving deep.